Hi, I'm Janet Gross. Welcome to Coping Today, a place where we talk about mental health and well-being. Lots of people talk about mental health issues and concerns these days. We're so much more aware of the need to recognize and help those who struggle with things. It seems so overwhelming. And we now also have so many who specialize in doing that. Dr. Roy Salgado, professor of counseling at the University of Holy Cross, is here to talk about the diverse array of mental health specialists, what they offer individually, sometimes in teams. A lot of people are out there waiting to help.
Right, and it's a good thing that these days the stigma that had once existed has dissipated somewhat with regard to mental health. 20, 30, 40 years ago, people, when they talked about their mental health and psychological or psychiatric conditions, they were apprehensive to do so. They didn't know what to do with that, and they didn't want to be labeled, if you will. But we're more informed now, and people are more open to receiving mental health services. And there are a number of different credentialed providers that do so, be they psychiatrists, psychologists, licensed professional counselors, licensed clinical social workers, licensed marriage and family therapists. The list goes on and on and on. Psychiatric nurse practitioners. There's so many different providers, each with their own specific skill sets that has a lot of overlap, but they all come together to offer help to those who may be struggling with different conditions.
So how do you choose? What's the criteria?
Right, it can be confusing because, people don't necessarily know who does what under what circumstances. And so there's a lot of overlap, as I had stated, but then there's specific skill sets that different credentialed specialists have in varying states. And so typically in our area, you might have a psychiatrist who does medication management and does that type of work. You might have a psychologist who does evaluations and assessments, diagnostic type of testing. You might have a licensed professional counselor who does more of the talk therapy, the weekly day in and day out type of service. The clinical social worker, perhaps, who looks for wraparound services in conjunction to see what basic needs and sociological aspects might be contributing to the conditions and the symptoms associated with a given case. Marriage and family therapists, perhaps working with the relational, interpersonal dynamic type of issues that present themselves. So depending on what's being presented and what the circumstance might be, you have different providers offering their specific skill sets and training to help meet the need of the individual who is struggling with a condition.
But you certainly want to find somebody you trust.
Yes, and wherever it is that you may go, the provider that you seek to help you in this, whether it be a team of individuals or an individual, someone that you definitely trust.
Okay. Well, when we come back, we're going to talk with one of the most recognized psychiatrists in the country who takes a different approach to mental health. Stay with us.
Everybody in my house knows how to ride a bike except me. People ask, how your children learn how to ride a bike and you didn't? I didn't teach them. I just created an environment where they taught themselves, and all I had to do was be there.
Welcome back. As we talk about mental health providers and specialties, we're joined by a well-known psychiatrist, best-selling author and lecturer. He's on public TV, TikTok, talk shows. He's famous for his views and ideas on actually looking at the brain while treating mental health issues. Dr. Daniel Amen, founder of the Amen Clinics, is here with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm so excited to be with you.
We are too, because I know you offer a different kind of treatment. We want to hear all about it. And it doesn't start with just tell me what's wrong, right? It's more than...
Well, no other medical doctor makes diagnoses based on symptom clusters with no biological data. Think about that. I mean, cardiologists look at your heart, orthopedic doctors look at your bones, gastroenterologists look at your gut, but psychiatrists listen to the patient and then get no biological data, decide they're schizophrenic, bipolar, depressed, panic disorder, without any biological data. And then they treat them with powerful drugs that change the brain to need them in order to feel normal, all with ever really not thinking about the health and function of the brain. And that's insane. And I started looking at the brain 30-some years ago, and it changed everything I do. And I have a book, one of my favorite books is called The End of Mental Illness, because I think we need to break this paradigm of, because when Lincoln was depressed in 1840, how did they diagnose him with melancholia? They talked to him, they looked at him, they looked at symptom clusters, and then they treated him. Think about that. That is still what's going on in late 2022. And looking at the brain teaches you things like mold, not uncommon here in New Orleans, is a major cause of psychiatric problems. That traumatic brain injury, you let your kids play football, increases their risk of psychiatric problems. If there are infections like Lyme or COVID, people who get COVID within the next 4 months have a 25% increased risk of a new onset mental health challenge. And nobody's sort of thinking about the brain as an organ. And when we change mental illness to brain health, nobody wants a mental illness. I heard you say, you know, stigma's going down, and that's really important, but it's not going down fast enough, right? 'Cause a lot of people say, I'm not going to see a psychiatrist, I'm not crazy. I must have heard that 1,000 times in my profession. But if you go, well, would you like a better brain? Everybody wants a better brain. So what if mental health was really brain health? But then you'd have to feed them right, because the brain is an organ. Then you'd have to teach them how to protect it, how to love it. And the end of mental illness begins with a revolution in brain health. And that's what I'm trying to create.
And with that revolution, that paradigm shift that you referred to, with the connection between brain and behavior, and brain and then the symptomology perhaps that one sees and wants to tend to treat, where did you get that shift from? What made you start to look at it differently and start to look at the brain, the organ, similar to what you said, a cardiologist looking at the heart?
So when I was 18, Vietnam was still going on, and I became an infantry medic, where my love of medicine was born. But about a year into it, I realized I didn't like being shot at. It was just not my thing.
That took a year, huh?
Some people are like okay with that. And I became an X-ray technician and developed a passion for medical imaging. Our professors used to say, how do you know unless you look? And then I got out of the Army, went to college and medical school. I went to Oral Roberts University for medical school, so I learned medicine in the context of my faith, which was really important. And someone I loved there tried to kill herself. And I took her to see a wonderful psychiatrist. And I came to realize if he helped her, which he did, it wouldn't just help her. That ultimately I could see it would help her children, it would help her grandchildren, is they would be shaped by someone who was happier and more stable. So I fell in love with psychiatry, but I realized it was the only medical specialty that never looked at the organ and treated. And then, 1979, I knew it was wrong and I knew it would change. I just had no idea I'd be part of the change.
What is the treat? I mean, how do you look inside somebody's brain?
So at Amen Clinics, I have 11 clinics around the country, we do a study called brain SPECT imaging. SPECT is a nuclear medicine study that looks at blood flow and activity. It looks at how the brain works. And it basically shows us three things: good activity, too little, or too much. And then my job is to balance it. So we take really detailed histories. I mean, I want to know all about your life, but then we look at your brain. And then we put those things together and we go, oh, you have a really sleepy brain. We need to stimulate it. And you can do that with exercise. You can do it with cold showers. You can do it with certain supplements or medication. Or say your brain works way too hard because it's inflamed, maybe from an infection like COVID. And it's like, oh, we have to calm it down. And there's a pattern in the brain we see for trauma, emotional trauma. Who hasn't been traumatized after the last couple of years? Their emotional brain works too hard. And I'm particularly fond of a therapy you probably know about, EMDR.
Yes.
Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. I studied it. It actually calms the emotional circuits in the brain. But how would you ever know really what to do unless you looked? The idea that we can make diagnoses based on symptom clusters is arrogant and it's pseudoscience. I mean, just think about it. It's like, oh, he's depressed. Take an SSRI. Very common. But they work no better than placebo in large-scale studies. But both you and I know, for the right person, they're a miracle. Right. For the wrong person, they're a nightmare. Right. Because depression is like chest pain. And nobody gets a diagnosis of chest pain. Why? because it doesn't tell you what's causing it and doesn't tell you what to do for it. Depression is the same. Depression, I wrote a book many years ago called Healing Anxiety and Depression. Talk about the 7 different types. You can have low activity and be depressed. Please don't give that person an SSRI. It'll disinhibit them and make them angry. You can have high activity and be depressed. You can have depression because you're drinking too much, because your brain's infected, because you had a head injury. You can be depressed because you have a lack of oxygen from a near drowning episode. And without looking, we have these simple answers that unfortunately we're just not in a good place. The outcomes in psychiatry are no better than they were in 1954, the year I was born. Think about that. We have not made progress despite billions of dollars in research, probably trillions, and all these medications. The number of people on disability for mental health problems is quadruple what it was in 1954. That's a problem.
It is a problem. I have a question with regard to the correlations between some of the things that you've seen. So what are some of the presenting things that people are coming in with in terms of the imaging and then the behaviors that you notice? So for example, if you have an inflamed brain, some of the symptomology correlated with it, what does that look like to the outside person?
So, fun story. I was just on the Kardashian show because Kendall Jenner came to see me and she's like, after I had COVID, I am so anxious and I have brain fog. And her brain, if you looked at her emotional circuits, they're just on fire. And so anxiety, depression, sometimes paranoia, but you can see the level of activity in her brain that is way above normal.
So are you starting to see, or I would imagine over the course of all of your life's work, that you're seeing correlations between the way certain scans look and then the symptomology or the behaviors that are expressed to the outside world?
Yeah,
so for example,
for example, somebody could be hypofrontal, means their frontal lobes, the front third of your brain, is low in activity. So more commonly associated with head trauma, also common with ADD, short attention span, distractibility, impulsivity, they're late, tend to be disorganized because the supervisor in their brain isn't sort of online.
Sure.
Now, what happens if your frontal lobes work too hard? Worried, rigid, inflexible, things don't go your way, you get upset, you tend to be argumentative and oppositional, things have to be a certain way or you explode. Or somebody I saw yesterday had left temporal lobe problems, mood instability, irritability, temper problems, dark thoughts. And so when you see it, it's like, so maybe an anticonvulsant for this person, if we're thinking of medicine, maybe an SSRI for someone whose brain works too hard, maybe a stimulant for someone who has low activity in their frontal lobes. I mean, the older I get, the more I start with natural things because, you know, medicines all have significant side effects, but sometimes they're absolutely essential.
You know, go ahead.
I'm fascinated by it. And layman here, sorry, I'm going to gum. Do you see different colors? How do you see, oh, this is hyperactive, this is slow, this is, I mean.
Yes. So we look at the activity. So the scan then goes through a computer and we can render it. And
it's like we're seeing some colors on the screen here.
Right,
so.
but you also see that big hole. In the blue, red, and white ones, blue is average activity, red is the top 15%, but white is the top 8%. So those are the super hot spots in the brain, which should be in the cerebellum, in the back bottom part of the brain. It's the brain's processor, has half the brain's neurons. But if you see a lot of increased or white activity in the front, you know that person's going to argue with you.
Okay. All right. So it really is a visual thing. You can look and see.
You can see it. And what I loved about it initially is, well, one, I had more information so I could be a better doctor. Patients began to see their problems as medical and not moral. and then they would fall in love with their brains. So when I first got scanned, so the week before we scanned my 60-year-old mother, she had a stunningly beautiful brain, which really reflected her life. 7 children, 50 grandchildren, great-grandchildren, consistent, reliable, predictable. If I said, hey, Mom, I've got 5 friends, can we come over for dinner tonight? She'd go, stop at the store and get me this. I mean, just easy and loving. I scanned myself the next week, and my brain looked toxic because I had meningitis twice when I was a young soldier. And I had bad habits, like I was getting 4 hours of sleep at night. And here I am, a double board certified psychiatrist. I was the top neuroscience student in medical school. I didn't care about my own brain until I saw it. And then I'm like, no, 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 I'm not going to have a worse brain than my 60-year-old mother. And I think everything I've done since 1991 to now is, how can I have a better brain? So you need to sleep. You need to eat right. You need to not believe every stupid thing you think, because having an unmanaged mind goes with chronic stress, right? And so I always think of people in 4 big circles. So what's the biology? And the brain scans help us with that. What's the psychology? How do you think? And we live in a society of undisciplined thinkers. What's the social circle? So what's going on in society, and how are your relationships? And we know what's been going on in our society is stressful. But also, what most psychiatrists never talk about is what's the spiritual circle, which is what's your relationship like with God, with the planet, with your past, with your future. Why are you here? I mean, the big questions. Purposeful people live longer and they're happier. And
that seems like a really big component to overlook.
Often overlooked. But as I said, I went to Oral Roberts University, so it was drilled into me, and we were taught to pray with our patients, and I just think it's so important. So for example, if you have problems in one of these circles, the other ones might be able to help it. But if you think of a school shooter, so I've been able to scan several school shooters, they have damage in all 4 of their circles. But yet I have a spiritual teacher, Byron Katie, who I love her work. She has a brain. I could get her off the death penalty. She has a bad brain, but she has a great soul, and that helps override it. But I think those 4 circles work together all of the time to create our health or to create our illness.
You know, and as I hear you speak, it's a comprehensive approach. And when we opened with the show, we talked about all these different mental health providers that offer different types of services within the sphere of wellness and mental health. With your work, psychiatry, and with these imaging scans and all of this other component, do other mental health providers work within teams? You have 11 clinics across the country. Who makes up the team that helps provide the services to your patients?
So we have psychiatrists, we have functional medicine doctors, we have therapists. That's the team. And it really works well, because think of it, why do we have functional medicine doctors if we're primarily psychiatric clinics? Because if your brain's not right, you're not right. And if your body's not right, it means your brain's not right. Because the whole point of the body is to carry around the brain, right? We can transplant almost any other organ, but it's the brain.
So if you are struggling with something, you come to you and you get a look at the brain, but do you tell them they can change their brain? I mean, that's obviously the goal, is to make it better. Can I make my brain better?
My big book, Change Your Brain, Change Your Life, is a bestseller for 40 weeks. It's based on that premise. You are not stuck with the brain you have.
No matter what point in life?
You can make it better. Well, I mean, the earlier you start, the better. I do a show on Instagram called Scan My Brain, where we take influencers and celebrities and we scan them. And I did Troy Gloss. He's the 2002 World Series MVP for the Angels. And he's drinking way too much. And he was anxious and depressed and had brain fog. And his brain looked awful. And got him to stop drinking, not a small task. Got him to take his supplements, exercise, eat better, lost 15 pounds. 2 months later, his brain's dramatically better.
In 2
and now
months.
we're in 2 months. His brain is dramatically better. I also did the big NFL study when the NFL was sort of not telling the truth about traumatic brain injury in football. I think all of us remember that time.
Yep.
And now everybody knows playing football is a brain damaging sport. Own it. 2 months later, on average, my NFL players had better brains when they did the things I asked them to do.
Still playing football?
No.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a
those
second.
behaviors as well.
That is the behavior you're not a fan of, right?
No, love football, hate what it does to the brain. And we have to just stop lying to ourselves, right? As a therapist, as a psychiatrist, I realize if you don't admit you have a problem, you can't fix it. And so when the NFL was in denial, they couldn't fix the problem. But now there's a lot of research, and unfortunately, still many of the players think, oh, I have CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and there's no hope for me. And that's a myth. What we've seen is I have this one Hall of Fame player who I just dearly love, and he calls me his brain savior. And I'm like, no, don't do that. But I'm like his brain angel, because he's done like 300 hyperbaric oxygen treatments, which is a treatment that's very helpful for people who have low activity in their brain. And he's sharp, and he's so much better, and he's nearing 80.
Now, I have a question for you with regard to this concept of being able to fix your brain and change your brain and improve your brain. Is that different from the concept of neuroplasticity, or is that what you're referring to in terms of changing your brain?
No, it's the same. And it happens, like if I don't sleep tonight, my brain's going to be worse tomorrow, because when you sleep, a whole new fluid system in your brain opens up and it cleans out the trash. Well, if your sleep is bad, trash builds up, and you're more likely to be anxious, you're more likely to have brain fog, you're more likely to be depressed. If I'm going to a big gala tonight, if I got drunk, my brain's going to be worse tomorrow. And that is cumulative over time. So every day you're making your brain better, or you're making it worse.
And with that, the 2 months number that you just threw out just really resonating with me. So is it something that can happen within relatively reasonable amounts of time? It's not something that it's a lifetime to change. You may have a lifetime of patterns that have not been the best for yourself, but implementing specific behavioral changes, changing the way one thinks and approaches their life, you can see the impact relatively quickly.
Relatively quickly. And it all boils down to this one simple question. Whenever you go to make a decision in your day, just ask yourself, it takes 3 seconds, is this good for my brain or bad for it? So when you're reaching for the sugar, bad. When you're reaching for the alcohol, bad. When you're reaching for marijuana, bad. When you're thinking about magic mushrooms, bad. And the big innovations in psychiatry, which it breaks my heart, but the big innovations are marijuana, ketamine, and magic mushrooms. Right. And I'm just horrified by what is happening to my profession. And now psychiatrists really have become the prescriber. And I'm like, no, I'm not the prescriber. My job is to give you drugs. I'm a healer, which means I have to be the one that works in all 4 of those circles.
And in the opening, we talked about that, how the different areas, the different credentialed providers have their niche, and that notion that the psychiatrist now is a medication management prescriber.
Not on your life. That is not why I went to medical school.
Right.
And in your training as a therapist, did they give you brain health training?
We didn't have brain health training in the way that you're describing it. It was very limited in terms of the way that you're describing it, but this is fascinating work.
Even though that's the organ you're working on.
That's the organ that we're working on, and we're looking to make that organ well.
And when it's well, you're happier.
Yes.
So if someone comes to your clinic and they learn a lot from you about what to do and how to handle, is there a time when they don't need to come back to the clinic, or is this a lifetime thing where you have to keep coming back and get your brain checked and all?
No, not everybody. I mean, you want to stay with us as long as you need us. And then periodically you want to get a checkup to go, well, how am I doing? Like with
what
the
color's my brain?
cardiologist. Yeah. How am I doing?
Yeah. Okay. So if you would say to somebody who is having a mental health issue, And of course, you're gonna, you have clinics and everything. But for somebody who there's no clinic around here, there's no. What would your advice be?
Well, I tell them to get one of my books. I mean, a long time ago, I realized not everybody's coming to one of the clinics to get a scan, so they can follow me on Instagram, they can follow me on TikTok, they can get The End of Mental Illness or You Happier. I have a new book coming out in March called Change Your Brain Every Day, because brain and mental health, just like physical health, are daily practices. If you want to be in the same jeans you were when you were in high school, that's a daily practice, right?
Yeah,
I have
is.
Just one other thing to say. I have obesity and heart disease in my family. And what I came to realize is that does not give me an excuse to be overweight or to do bad things. I need to be on an obesity and heart disease prevention program every day of my life. I adopted my 2 nieces because both their parents were addicts. And I'm like, you have addiction in your family. You need to be on an addiction prevention program every day of your life. So when I caught my niece vaping, I grounded her for 6 months because I'm like, oh no, we need to be aligned on this. And she's smart enough to know I was dead serious because of the risk. So if you have depression in your family, you need to be on a depression prevention program, which means eating fruits and vegetables and getting things like cognitive behavior therapy. I call it killing the ants, where you learn how to not believe every stupid thing you think. Day in and day out, we need to protect our minds and our brains. That's a daily practice.
Thank you so much for being here. I know you got a busy schedule and you're all over the place. We really appreciate you taking a little time to come and talk with us.
It was an honor. Thank you so very much.
Yes.
What a joy. Thank you.
Dr. Amen, appreciate you being here again. So we'll be back in a minute. Stay with us.
My biggest fear in the middle of my addiction was that I would never be able to get over it and that my kids wouldn't have a father. I started thinking, you know what? This isn't my story. For the longest time, fear held me back from ultimately being who I wanted to. I had to become a better man to be a better father. It's important to me that my kids are empowered and truly believe that if they can think it, they can do it.
And welcome back. So much to think about after talking with Dr. Amen. He's just fascinating.
Phenomenal.
Yeah.
And just the idea of having a paradigm shift in mental health and wellness, and we need to. And one of the statistics that he pointed out, that the numbers of individuals who are on SSI, if you will, and disabled because of mental health issues has quadrupled in the past several decades. And so that's something we need to really look at. And to have that paradigm shift, to be able to look at it holistically, the organ, look at the brain itself to see what that looks like and see how that is impacting and what it's correlated to with regards to symptomology and behaviors, is a very good approach of looking at things, and something that perhaps psychiatrists and other mental health providers need to start to look at it, because there's certain things that we have been doing that perhaps we need to think about doing it a little bit differently.
Isn't it great to be challenged all the time?
It's wonderful.
You
And
don't want to be stuck.
If you stay stuck, then you never learn, and you have to be open to new ideas and new ways of doing things to see what's possible. And so this is another approach, another way of looking at things to see what's possible towards mental health and wellness.
And you never want to diss something that sounds, hey, that sounds right. You want to, eat better, do all the things he was talking about,
Right.
exercise,
Right.
think
Sleep,
about
fruits,
Yes.
vegetables, water, staying hydrated, all of those things are exercise, moving, all those things are very important to our overall health and wellness.
Okay. All right. Well, we've run out of time, but we want to thank you, Dr. Roy Salgado, for talking things through as always. And we want to thank Dr. Amen, our really special guest today, for being here. And thank you for watching and being a part of Coping Today.